Thank you very much, Christina. We're going to make this fairly brief because Stephen Dorrell here has to leave the class, so we're going to do a slightly different format where he's going to speak, and then we'll open up to the floor for a few minutes before he leaves at 4:15, and then we'll carry on after that. My name's Graham Godwin-PEARSON. My team and I consult to the Conservative Party. I've done for a little while, and enough about me really. I'm the least important person up on this stage. Stephen Dorrell, sitting here immediately next to me. He was a member of Parliament here in the UK between 1979 and 2015, and a member of the government from 1987 to 1997, serving as a minister in the Treasury, the Department of Health, the Department of National Heritage, if anyone remembers that. He was a member of the Cabinet as Secretary of State for the National Heritage from 1994 to 1995, and Health Secretary 95 to 97, becoming Chair of the NHS Confederation in November 2015 and Chair of the European Movement in December 2016. He was also Chairman of Langbury-Son Limited, a healthcare market intelligence company, and its sister company, Public Policy Projects Limited, which provides public policy advice. Just very quickly, Professor Matthew Goodwin, next to Stephen there, is an academic, a writer and a speaker, known mainly for his work on British and European politics, of course, hopefully. Populism, Brexit and elections, and we might delve a little bit into what we mean exactly by those things there. He's Professor of Politics at Rutherford College, University of Kent, and Senior Visiting Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. He's a trained political scientist and has been undertaking research for almost 20 years, publishing 5 books, dozens of articles, and research reports. And Patrick HENEGHAN, is that it? HENEGHAN, sorry. Too much alcohol last night, too much coffee this morning. The former Executive Director of the Labour Party in the UK, where he was responsible for elections across the country, also data, campaigns, field organisation and insight. So that's enough about that. Let me open the floor, please, to Stephen Dorrell.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come this morning. And I need to make the first mistake, which is to open with an apology for leaving early. You would think you'd be reasonably safe if you invited somebody who'd done 36 years in the House of Commons to come and talk about politics, that he wouldn't have to leave early in order to go to do politics. But unfortunately, that is precisely what I've got to do, with apologies. You've given the introduction which goes through the offices that I've held. I think the simple way of introducing myself is to say that I am what I always have been, which is a liberal conservative. That poses one or two problems to anyone interested in British politics at this moment, which is why I'm leaving here to go and pursue my interest in liberal conservatism. And in asking me to talk about the current political scene in Britain, I'm billed, I think, as the spokesperson from the Conservative Party. I'm absolutely certain, actually, that what I'm to say would not be universally endorsed within the Conservative Party, because the fundamental point I want to make this morning is don't underestimate the scale of the crisis in British politics. The reason why I say that is that we have in office at this moment a government which is universally recognised, although there are good people in it, to have neither political authority nor simple bandwidth, brain space, to think about any significant area of public policy except in the context of Brexit. Brexit is not merely disturbing our politics, it is misshaping public policy, because it is the question which raises its head whether you're talking about the area of my core interest in health and public services, whether you're talking about our relationship with our strategic allies, whether you're talking about economics, whether you're talking, as was in the previous session, about migration. Brexit lies at the very heart of British politics, which is one fact about British politics, but the second fact is actually much, much more damaging to the political process and political accountability in Britain, which is summed up by two incidents. The first was a few months ago when the Prime Minister was asked which way would she vote if the referendum happened again. She didn't answer. Even now, 10 days ago, she spoke at the Mansion House and told us we have to accept a whole series of hard facts about Brexit. The first question from a German journalist was, is it worth it? To which she didn't give an answer. So we have a government that is building a whole programme of public policy around a core building block that the Prime Minister refuses to endorse. And we know that the majority of members of the present government and the great majority of members of the current House of Commons voted against on referendum day. That isn't merely a problem of legitimacy for a group of ministers who hold office on the day. That's a problem of legitimacy for the whole principle of representative government. Because when ministers are in a corner and they can't think of anything else to justify their policy, they say, we're carrying out the instruction of the British people. Well, as I remember, in Nuremberg, we were carrying out instructions. Wasn't a defense. More fundamentally, you can't turn around when things go wrong and say we did it because we were carrying out instructions. The principle of representative democracy is that ministers believe in what they're doing and are held to account for its consequences. That's the principle which is under threat in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and I'm not pretending it's easy for ministers, but the circumstance is that the majority of people who are in the current government didn't vote, didn't support the core policy, which is around which the whole government programme is being built. Now, move on from that to think about what is the problem that led to the referendum result and with which this government and governments elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the Western world, are grappling. The core problem, I think, is that there is a recognition on the part of a very wide group of people in society that the current settlement doesn't deliver to them. That's why President Trump was elected. It's why populists are gathering support in different countries in the European Union. It isn't, as I quite often say to people, they don't understand. Oh yes, they do understand. They're rebelling against a settlement which isn't delivering to them. And so the challenge to those in representative government is to deliver a new settlement that does deliver improving living standards, improving public services, and on which ministers are willing to be held to account when polling day comes, when it's their record that is judged. When you're standing on a doorstep, talking to a voter, explaining why the government's record that you supported was the best that could be done in the circumstances, which is all you ever can do in a representative democracy. It was the best we could do. It wasn't bad. We did some things right, other things didn't work. You have to own the result. You can't turn round and say to the voters, I didn't support it, it's your fault. That doesn't work. That's a developing crisis of legitimacy in democracy. That is not a way out, that's a way in.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen has to shoot off in a couple of minutes, so before we move on to the other panelists, has anyone got any quick questions for Stephen? I have two mics here. Mark.
So are you suggesting that the appropriate democratic response, small d democratic response, is to simply ignore the referendum, ignore the wishes expressed by the British people?
No, I absolutely am not proposing that. My position as I chair the European movement is that I think it's important for those who take an interest in public affairs to demonstrate the consequences of carrying out a Brexit decision, and since it was the people who initiated this process, I think it's the people who should have the meaningful vote the government, quite rightly in my view, has promised us.
Evgeny.
Thank you so much. So I have a question. If you say here that there is a serious crisis in British politics, could yesterday's Theresa May's speech towards Russia in a quite aggressive manner be connected with these inner problems? So if we can solve those problems, so we can find the enemy somewhere outside.
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think on that that is one of the relatively few issues in recent times, in truth, where the House of Commons was by current standards exceptionally united. I think the leader of the opposition, I'm not here to make party points, I think he misjudged it, but I think that from across the House of Commons, from different points of view yesterday, there was a very clear view that this is a strategic threat to Britain and wider Western interests, which needs to be recognised and addressed.
Can I just bounce that back to you, Jerry? Do you think Russia's responsible for what happened in Italy?
I don't know. I am not an expert.
Actually, yes. And I guess it has to be an investigation, and that's all. And the only thing I know that it's too early to say that we blame them and only them. So I guess it has to be an investigation.
But I think what the Prime Minister said yesterday, frankly, was spot on. Either acknowledge it or disown it.
Any more questions, anyone? No, I think that's good. Oh, sorry, Razor.
Hi, this is Reza Kazanger from Germany. What would you suggest to be the relations between the future Europe and Great Britain?
I am interested. Europe is an evolving picture. There is an evolution going on within the EU. I very much hope Britain will continue to be part of that. I referred already to the fact I chair the European movement. The European movement celebrates its 70th year today. It incidentally exists across continental Europe. It's not just in Britain. The founder of the European movement in Britain was Winston Churchill. And when this is represented as being an economic argument, I always remind people, whatever else Winston Churchill is remembered for, it isn't for his expertise in economics. The reason that Churchill was an advocate of European unity, of engagement with Europe, is that he understood that and he and his generation had learnt that it wasn't merely about living standards, it was about security, it was about the stability of societies, that the common interest of European countries was far more important than the things that divided them. We've had 1,000 years of military alliance. People quite often think that security is about armies. It isn't about armies, it's about a common agenda. You build security by building successful, stable societies, and that is a common interest of every European nation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good round of applause. So, Matthew, Professor Matthew Goodwin, would you like to
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me along to your discussion. I wanted to spend a few minutes and just talk about the cause and consequence of the Brexit vote, where we are in Britain, and also how that relates in some ways to Europe. The first thing to say is we have more data on public opinion, elections, voting and campaigns than ever before, but we seem to be consistently getting things wrong. And I say that in terms of the broad level. There was a survey 1 month before the Brexit referendum of around 300 journalists, academics and opinion pollsters in Britain, and between 87% and 97%, depending on which group you looked at, predicted that Britain would vote to remain in the European Union. If you'd gone into a bookies, betting on politics is legal in Britain, and put £100 that the people were going to vote for Brexit on the morning of the referendum, you would have made a £300 profit. If you put £100 that the people were going to vote for Brexit when the polls are closed, later that evening, you would have made a £900 profit. As somebody who was running an exit poll on the day, I can tell you that Leave was 7.5 points ahead by 11 o'clock in the morning. And that lead was whittled down during the afternoon to about 2 points, and then key sections of the Remain electorate failed to mobilise. London, millennials, middle-class professionals in key districts. And it was rather ironic that after the referendum, the number of signatures for a second referendum was highest in Camden, Shoreditch, Hackney, that had lower than average levels of turnout when it really mattered. Turnout was highest in working class constituencies, where people felt this was their one opportunity to put their concerns onto the agenda. Many of those voters then didn't vote again at the general election in 2017. They just went back into apathy. I'm going to tell you over 5-6 minutes why Brexit was entirely predictable, and why the fundamentals always favoured Brexit, and why, when we look at public opinion on Remainers and Leavers today, why we are not going to see any fundamental shifts in public opinion. The first point is Britain never fell in love with the European Union, we all know this. But we forget. If I can recommend one book, go and read Sir David Butler's book on the 1975 referendum. David made the point that British support for staying in what was then called the European Community was wide, but not deep. There was, in his words, no girding of the loins for the great European adventure. The Brits joined because of economic pragmatism. They never believed in the European project in an identity sense. Over the next 2.5, 3 decades, if you looked at British public opinion and you asked the Brits, do you feel British? Do you feel English? Do you feel European? At its peak, never more than 16% of British voters said they felt European. That was a fundamental weakness for the Remain campaign. It was an inbuilt weakness. And we can all discuss why that's the case. Was it the tabloids? Was it the media? Was it irresponsible political leadership? Whatever. But it was fundamental. It was the foundation of Brexit. Now, by the time you get to the late 1990s, early 2000s, and we have a new Labour government that's talking a lot about families, but not a lot about workers, something interesting happens in Britain. The working class, or large numbers of working class voters, simply drift into apathy. And those that stopped voting were significantly more likely the Labour Party no longer cares about the working class. They cared about immigration, but they felt the political system was not responsive. And most of them stayed in apathy. In some northern communities, they voted for a far-right party. Later on, some of them defected to the UK Independence Party, which was not only a party for disaffected Labour workers, it was also a party for quite affluent southern social conservatives. And I was listening to the earlier panel, and one of the weaknesses in this economic insecurity equals populism narrative is that there are lots of affluent social conservatives that like populism, or that like socially conservative, anti-immigration, anti-European Union forms of politics. 1 in 4 of Trump's voters earned over $100,000 per year. Large chunks of the Brexit and UKIP electorate were affluent Southern social conservatives. If all you needed for a recession, if all you needed for Nigel Farage and people like that was a recession, then how can you explain that in Britain, the populists actually first really broke through in 2004 after 48 consecutive periods of growth? The 2004 European Parliament election was a big breakthrough moment for the UK Independence Party, and then it accelerated during the crisis. But like France, like Italy, like Austria, like Switzerland, I mean, we forget this, but one of the most successful ultra-conservative right-wing movements is in one of the most affluent, stable, secure countries on the planet. We forget that because we say it's the crisis, it's austerity. It isn't. It's about values. Ronald Inglehart in 1977 was bang on the money when he said that as the West becomes more affluent and highly educated, people will drift to progressive post-materialist values, but they'll leave behind an alliance of blue-collar workers and social conservatives that will eventually push back. And it took them 20 years to push back, but they did through Brexit, through Marine Le Pen, through the League in Italy, whatever. But the values backlash is far more about how people see the world than it is about their objective economic experience. And we can debate this until the cows come home, but I'm 100% of that view, which is why when you look at Brexit, the values that united Brexit voters, both blue-collar workers in the north, social conservatives in the south, I'm simplifying, but in general terms, were very similar, despite their completely different life experiences. They were anxious about immigration. That was the biggest driver of the Brexit vote, by a mile. But they also felt that the system wasn't listening to them. 1 year before Brexit, if you looked at the British working class, 1 in 2 said people like me have no say in government. Should not have been a surprise. My last point about where we are today is that I would suggest the Remain camp in Britain, pro-EU campaign groups, have fundamentally failed to reflect on what has just happened in Britain. The conversation has been what London wants, what financial services want, what the city wants. The conversation has not been about how to address the grievances that led to Brexit. We've had no serious discussion about how to invest in England's stagnating coastal communities, where 70% voted for Brexit. We've had no major discussion about how to relocate political and economic institutions outside of London, despite the fact we know that anger and alienation to the establishment was strongest in non-London parts of England. We've had no major discussion about redistribution in a meaningful sense, or how to devise an immigration policy that, on the one hand, meets those voters' desire for control, but is also progressive. At very broad level, if you are a Leave voter and you look at the debate that we've had over the last 18 months, you can only really conclude, and I'm simplifying and being slightly provocative, that they don't get it, even still. And as a consequence, no matter what source of data you do look at, take the YouGov tracker, in hindsight was Britain right or wrong to vote for Brexit, we have seen absolutely no meaningful shift in public opinion since the vote. That is not a surprise. There's been no serious, meaningful attempt to engage with those voters and to have a conversation with them about one point I agreed with in terms of the previous speaker was how to renew the social contract. That conversation has been completely absent. Hopefully that's enough to spark some conversation and no doubt some disagreement, which is great. Thank you very much.
Patrick, could you
Okay. Thank you for inviting me here this morning. Again, as Stephen said, he's billed as the Conservative Party and I'm billed as the Labour Party. Obviously, I'm a member of the Labour Party still, but I no longer work for them. In fact, if I did, I wouldn't be allowed to participate in this event today. So just bear that in mind as I sort of talk through things. I mean, I think you've heard from the two speakers, the impact essentially of Brexit on British politics is all-consuming. And I just, after working for 20 years for the Labour Party, resigned at the end of last year. And if you just sort of step back a second, if you look back to the last 4 years in British politics, what you see is an incredible period of change, basically, that has left our current situation, I think, for the two main parties in a point of crisis. If you look back to 2014, which was just 3.5 years ago, we had a Scottish referendum where we came very close to Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Since that point, we've had 2 general elections where the Labour Party was wiped out in Scotland, where David Cameron achieved the first Conservative majority in nearly a quarter of a century, against all the odds and against what all the polling companies and all the speculation in the media was. We've seen Jeremy Corbyn, who was a very far-left fringe candidate in part of the Labour Party, take over the Labour Party, win a second leadership challenge and increase the membership of the Labour Party to 600,000 people. We've seen an EU referendum, which again, as Matt said there, was widely seen to be going to go the side of Remain. We've seen Britain vote to leave the European Union, and the consequences of Brexit, both in terms of our politics and what it means for the parties, are only starting to be seen now. The first consequence, of course, was the outcome of the snap election. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, following David Cameron, called a snap election specifically to get a large majority to be able to deal and negotiate a better Brexit deal for the UK. She did that while she was 24 points ahead in the polls, and at that point all the predictions were that the Labour Party would be essentially wiped out and would be looking at a Conservative government with anywhere near between 150 to 200 seat majority. What actually happened was that she lost her overall majority, had to do a deal with the hardline unionists of DUP in Northern Ireland to prop them up in Parliament. So the government has lost its majority when it specifically said it needed a bigger majority to be able to negotiate breakfast. Everyone, breakfast, yeah. Breakfast means Brexit, certainly in Britain. And the outcome of that for the Conservative Party, as you heard Stephen here today articulate a view which is obviously quite different to the official Conservative Party line, is that they are radically split, and they're radically split on this particular issue. And Theresa May, we know she'll vote Remain, we know she probably still would vote Remain, is leading a caucus in Parliament that is at odds with a considerable, if not a minority, but a considerable minority within the Conservative Party. Specifically for the other parties, the outcome of the snap election, in fact the outcome of British politics in the last few years, is essentially a return to the two-party system. We used to have a party that was used to poll over 20% in the UK called the Liberal Democrats. Essentially they have been reduced to a rump in the last few years as a product of them going into coalition with the Conservatives. UKIP, which started to rise in the 2004 European elections and polled I think 13% in the 2015 general election, has all but been wiped out in the course of Brexit, and we've seen for the first time in a long time both main political parties polling over 40% in the last general election. So we've seen a rise of two-party politics, bringing us back to a place where we hadn't been since the 1970s in the UK. And the consequences of that and the consequences of Brexit are playing out within all the political parties. So I mentioned a bit about the Conservative Party, and I think Stephen articulated quite strongly where his group and his interest within the Conservative Party sit. In terms of the Labour Party, there's been a lot of change. I think the biggest change for us was the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Jeremy was 1,000 to 1 when he first put his name forward to be elected as leader of the Labour Party. But what people didn't fully understand is we had moved to a different election system, a sense of open primary where people could pay £3 and have a vote in the leadership election. That brought us from a party of just 200,000 people participating to nearly 600,000 people participating. And Jeremy Corbyn, who had been a very fringe political voice on the far left of the party, gaining power. And gaining power in a party where still the levers of power controlled by people he principally opposed. So the MPs in Parliament, the people that controlled the National Executive Committee, the senior staff in the organisation. And so we had a very fractured and divided party for a number of years. And going into 2016, after Jeremy had been seen to not be as perhaps proactive in the European referendum campaign as people would have liked, there was a second leadership challenge, which again, he won by nearly 60% of the vote. And following that, we see Theresa May elected. And going into 2017, there was a sense within the Labour Party that we were in a pretty bad place. We were aware that there was a possibility of a snap election, but we were aware that the Prime Minister had specifically ruled it out. And then it came. In April 2017, we were around 24% behind in the polls, and Mrs May went out onto the steps of Downing Street and said that she needed to call a snap election in 7 weeks in the national interest to get a big majority. And we knew why she was really calling it, because she was massively ahead in the polls, and she feared that she might not be able to cash in on such a big advantage at any point in the future. And we were 24 points behind at the polls. And what happened in that campaign has been well documented. We ended up just 3% behind, and people widely pay tribute to some of the new innovations that we had within the campaign. But we were not ready for that. It was panic stations on day one, and actually 2.5 weeks into that campaign, there was local elections. So councils all around the country were electing councillors, and in fact, them election results were the worst for any opposition party in nearly 2 decades. So where we were in the national opinion polls was pretty much accurate. In fact, going into the local elections, the assessment I was given the leadership of the party is we're going to lose 300-400 councillors. Yeah, that was pretty much consistent with what we thought we were in the national opinion polls, and that's by and large what happened. So it was a real position. So unlike any other campaign that I've been involved in, we were able to basically put 20 points on in 4 weeks. Now that is quite incredible, and the reasons for that, I probably haven't really got time to go into it. But what it meant for the Labour Party is when the exit poll came out on the night of the poll, when the results were clear, when we were able to see that actually she had lost a majority, is that the position of Jeremy Corbyn and the far left of the Labour Party was absolutely secure within the party. People were ready to challenge him. It was understood that we were going to lose and lose big, but actually coming out of that, Jeremy in the left's position within the Labour Party is absolutely secure. And since that, they've taken full control of the NEC. They will have control of the General Secretary and the Labour Party staff in just 1 week from today. And that means that actually the Labour Party, in some sense, is a completely different organ to where it was in terms of the last 15 to 20 years. And what does that mean for Brexit? Well, a lot of the people in the far left faction have ideological opposition to European Union and single markets around sort of like problems with markets full say. But what my view is that the current leadership is a bit more pragmatic than people give it credit for. I think their position on the customs union has changed, and I think their position on the single market may change. And what they're very aware of is that given what happened in December, there was a vote in Parliament on the 13th of December, which basically said that the House of Commons has to have a say on the deal. The very, very clear view of the British public is that the deal isn't very good. And that bring that forward to later in the year, there's a very distinct possibility, if the Tory rebels stay rebelling, is that you could see the British government, and we'll have to see Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party backing these amendments, backing Conservative amendments to reject the bill. Now, what happens at that point? God knows, but you can see that we might have to withdraw Article 50, delay Article 50, there might have to be a change in the Conservative Party, there might be, God forbid, a second referendum, or indeed another general election. But all these things are unclear, and it's this uncertainty in British politics for both the two main parties that is, in one sense, fascinating, but also is really destabilising for our politics, and leads to essentially the inability, as Stephen outlined, the ability of our politicians to think beyond tomorrow, just think past the current crisis and deal with the political problems that we have outside Brexit and the long-term trends that Matt Goodwin talked about in terms of why Brexit actually happened. But I think the one thing we have learned in the last few years in British politics is that we should always expect the unexpected and take nothing for granted, and by and large, there's always usually another election within the next year. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we just open before we open the panel to the floor for questions, I've got a quick question for the both of you, which is should and can Brexit be stopped? Both the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, we're not going to see any major change in public opinion on the fundamental question. Now, we have seen some changes. So British voters have become more pessimistic about how they see Theresa May managing Brexit. They've become more pessimistic about the economic effects of Brexit, certainly. Of course, it was never really an economic vote, and dissatisfaction with the incumbent is not surprising. But on the key question of, in hindsight, was this right or wrong, we really have not seen any changes outside the margin of error. In terms of the vote that Patrick raised in Parliament, this is going to be the crunch moment at the end of this year. My instinct is actually that it will pass, and I'll just tell you one reason. Whenever the Conservative rebels have really been confronted with this option of, do they side with the party, do they go with the country, do they want Jeremy Corbyn in number 10, or do they want to hold the Conservative government together? I think by the time we get to the autumn, when you put that fact alongside the fact that around half a dozen Labour MPs who were in northern pro-Brexit seats are also leaning through much of this legislation are siding with the government. I think she'll squeak it. I think she'll get that vote through. And if that happens, of course, that effectively is game over. If I'm completely wrong, and we end up in a second referendum scenario, there's absolutely nothing, to be frank, that's come out of the Remain camp over the last 18 months that's led me to the conclusion that they can cut through to the voters that they need to cut through with. There's been absolutely no innovation in terms of the messengers. It's wheel out Blair, wheel out Clegg, wheel out unelected lords who, to be frank, look slightly unhinged at times. But there's no innovation on the message. There's no new message to connect with leaders. It's the same old. It's Project Fit. And the one thing that's changed, and then I'll hand over to Patrick, who I'm sure probably disagrees with me, but the one thing that has changed is this. The core narrative for the Remain camp has been weakened. Long term, the economic effects of Brexit, I have no doubt, will be disruptive, unsettling, and all the rest of it. But they put so many of their chips on short-term economic forecasts that have turned out to be frank, wrong, and the economy is still growing and is more resilient than they suggested. And we can debate this till the cows come home, but that is the viewpoint of the average voter is, the ceiling hasn't fallen in.
It's also the viewpoint, of course, of David Cameron, who's overheard saying in Davos, it's not as bad as we thought.
So I haven't seen the innovation that would lead to a big change in life.
Okay, I don't entirely disagree, but I do disagree slightly, and in two respects. One is that the referendum was close, and what happens in Parliament towards the end of this year will be close, right? Now, it's very plausible that Theresa May squeaks through with a few votes, but it's very, very plausible. I mean, she lost the December member by 4 votes, and there's a group of Conservative Scottish MPs that have not yet come into play, who have, I think, a role to play in this. So it is conceivable that she loses that vote. But also the other thing I will say is that, having worked in a political party, parties often put what is their own interest above the country. Now, we can debate whether that is right or wrong, and for both parties, at some point, it may well be in their interests, in terms of party unity, to support this second vote, rather than going down the road that essentially leads to greater splits and divisions within the party. So, just bearing that in mind, you can see a scenario where both leaderships actually take a pragmatic view that rather than alienate a big chunk of their party, it's better to paper over with a call for a second referendum. So on that basis, I wouldn't rule it out. I think it is probably odds on at the moment, 60–65%, that she will win that deal and we will proceed and exit the European Union in March 2019. But still at 30–35%, that means that I would suspect that, well, based on British politics in the last 4 years, anything's happening.
Thank you. Right, who's got questions? Matt.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of a wonky analytics and modeling question for Patrick. We saw this as a problem in the Hillary campaign, where in the last couple of weeks with the shifting sands in the electorate, that the models, the analytics models that they had used to score the voters became dated, and they weren't able to quickly change the models in order to get that down to the field and the digital operations that were using them. Given what you said about the council elections that happened in May and then the general election that happened a month later, I imagine that you may have had some changes in your modeling. How were you all able to keep up with that? And what do you see as what I call the quickly shifting sands problem? How does modeling and analytics address this in future campaigns?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right there. I mean, obviously, the modelling that we undertook at the start of the campaign was, the base polling numbers, what you put into models is what you get out, right? You can get a more sophisticated, granular view of what's happening, but fundamentally, if you're putting wrong numbers into it at the top, you're going to get inaccurate modelling at the bottom. And the models that we created at the start of the process, 5 weeks before polling days, 6 weeks before polling days, had fundamentally different types of outcomes as what actually happened. Now that said, we did update them, and we updated them every week. Fundamentally, our polling was showing us, a minimum of 10 to 12 points behind all the way through. So under any circumstances, if they're the raw numbers that you're putting in from the polling companies into the models, is still going to be out in the end. Now, also the scale of what campaigns do in terms of like field organisation means that, you know, if you're modelling and you want that to basically impact on who you're talking to on the doorstep or what direct mail they're getting, there's a lag, and it's a lag of 3 or 4 days. And if people are changing their mind as they appear to be doing, or public opinion is shifting quite quickly, that sort of field campaign can't really take advantage of that. That said, social media and digital advertising can be a lot quicker, and I think for the first time ever, we've spent, you know, well over millions of pounds on sort of social media advertising, and certainly in the final period of the campaign, we were able to skew that into groups that, if we were trying to do that through traditional field techniques, would have been too late for us.
Can I ask a quick question about that? I heard from a few people on the Labour side that one of the problems in that campaign as to why they weren't picking up the swing to Labour and this upsurge of support was that they were just simply knocking on the wrong doors, essentially, and that some of the field data was out of date. Is that true?
I mean, right. So this is quite complex, right? So, in a sense, we were making our decisions of large landscape polls, so 50,000 sample polls that BMG or ICM were doing for us, and they were showing us one thing. Now, you're right, if there was a movement on the doorstep, you know, we are talking to 150,000 people per day, with that data being recorded into a database, you would expect to see some sort of movement. Now, you're right, that wasn't really showing up. I mean, there was panic in the first few weeks of the campaign, as people were saying that, you know, the vote was crumbling, and we could see that in the field data. But we didn't pick up a swing in the last few weeks. And the point that we're knocking on the wrong doors is probably correct, because there's been a tendency, I think, in British politics, and I think most sort of targeted campaigns over the last 20 years, is to, when it comes to the final period of campaigns, focus down on the people that you think are going to vote for you. So you start with an electorate, 100% electorate. You're not going to be able to knock on everyone's door, so you make decisions about which doors you include and which doors you exclude. So you tend to do that on the basis of previous voting or what the polling data say, or other commercial data or models that you might create. Now that has led to a position where in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, you really quite a neat small pool, basically, of people that you think are high probability Labour, maybe middle probability turnout, because you want to engage with them and turn them out. Now that works for us if we are in a world where we have limited resources, limited volunteers on the doorstep, and also a world where actually politics doesn't change that much within campaigns. But within this campaign, quite remarkably, you know, if you are adding on 20% to your vote within 4 weeks, yeah, and you don't know, and you are in a position where you're only knocking on, say, a third of the electorate's door, because that's generally where you find your votes, you are probably in a position where you don't see that coming, and I think that was the case for Labour Party.
We've got 2 minutes left, so one more quick question, I think.
Hi there. I'm Walter Ludwig from Brussels in the US, and this is mostly a question for Professor Goodwin. You talk about the fact that there hasn't been an appreciable shift in the baseline numbers on Brexit. And I wonder if that's largely because there actually haven't been, I mean, when Cameron says it hasn't been so bad, it hasn't happened yet. There haven't been any significant actual consequences except for political instability as opposed to actual economic consequences. Do you feel it's possible that when those numbers, those baseline numbers could change when in fact there's actual pain?
Well, it's $1 million question, isn't it? I think I'll tell you, my instinct is the baseline numbers are worse for Remain than what's being reported. Because the reason I say that is I don't think that the polling industry has currently corrected its sampling problem to the extent that it should have done. And a lot of the voters, I mean, we discovered this problem at a succession of recent elections, not all of them, but some of them, the pollsters were pretty good, some of them less so. But there is an underlying sampling problem that means a lot of the classic levers are just not going to be getting picked up to the same extent. So my instinct is actually that it's not where it is. I think it's probably a little bit more toward the Leave side. Will they change their minds? I really don't think so. A classic Leave voter, you know, hasn't had a pay rise for 15 years before the referendum. It's certainly not going to be feeling, you know, any good economic wins over the next few years. A lot of these views were entrenched. They're about migration, which is only going to increase even if we have controls on free movement because of past migration patterns. And also it's driven by a sense that the political institutions are not being responsive and don't care what ordinary people think. And when you have a lot of politicians shouting that the people were too stupid to understand what was going on and they should never have been given a referendum in the first place, that kind of entrenches the fundamentals, right? So if I were advising the Leave campaign or advising the Remain campaign, I think one of whilst advising Remainers, I'll be saying, you need to change your leadership, and you need to come up with new messengers who have something new to say about this issue. If I was advising the Leave campaign, I'll be saying, actually, just stay quiet and let this rumble on. There's nothing really they need to do at this point in time. So I just genuinely don't think there will be a fundamental shift because of economic reasons, because it was never an economic vote really to begin with, and there will be some in the audience who say, well, yeah, actually it was a reflection of economic pain for one section of the Brexit electorate, for one section. But I mean, the alliance that delivered that Brexit vote was a combination of quite affluent, stable, secure voters and economically disadvantaged working class voters. So it's it's a varied mix.
Thank you, Everson. Do you
Yeah, I just yeah. I mean, I agree to some extent there, which is like, all things being equal, it would remain pretty much the same as last time. But I think that the Remain campaign could do a better job of basically articulating a values-based reason for staying in the European Union. I just will point to one point, which I think you mentioned earlier about the turnout in the referendum as opposed to the general election. If, for example, those people that had voted in the referendum, and you only counted the ones that turned out to vote in the 2017 general election, so you had a lower turnout filter, and you mentioned earlier about how turnout wasn't great in parts of inner London that we know would hugely remain. But if you applied the filter of the turnout to the 2017 election, we've seen this through the British election study data, Remain would have won 54-46 on our numbers, and that shows you actually when the vote is 52-48. Perhaps just run it again, all things being equal, some little changes in turnout here and there, and you could have a slightly different result. So who knows?